All right, so today we are talking about the Ottoman Empire. You have your handout called Chapter 23, Ottoman Empire. Let's work through this together. So it says on your handout on the very top that during the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of decline. And so well, the Ottoman Empire used to be one of the most powerful empires in the world. You might remember at one point, the Ottoman Empire had invaded part of Europe. In fact, we see that on the map. They invaded this part of Europe, and what did they do to like white Christian boys here in the Balkans? They they kidnapped them, they enslaved them, and they made them into soldiers. In fact, there's a vocabulary word we should remember about these white Christian kids who became soldiers. They were called, man, Janissers, you guys are on top of it today. So smart. Well, unfortunately, as time has gone by for the Ottoman Empire, they went from like the most amazing empire ever, where white Europeans were afraid of them, to entering into a period of decline. In fact, things got so bad on the handout that local leaders even tried to exercise their independence. Some local leaders kind of wanted to break away and do their own thing. One area that wanted to do that is this area called Arabia. You might remember that, I mean, if you look at this map, this is land, this is the Arabian Peninsula. No one conquers this because it's mainly just desert. But why would they want these cities, Medina and especially Mecca? What's important about Mecca? Exactly right, man, Samantha. 5 times a day, Muslims pray towards Mecca. It's the direction of prayer. But also, as Samantha correctly pointed out, you have to perform Hajj. Once in your life, you have to go if you have the health and you have the wealth. So, or there could be severe consequences because it's a requirement. So, very good. It says on the handout that local leaders try to exercise their independence. And for Arabia, the family that wanted to kind of break off Arabia, it was the Saud family. That's spelled, if you don't know, Saud, the Saud family. And we actually get the name for this country today. It's called Saudi Arabia, which is like Arabia of the Saud family. So the Saud family, under the leadership of Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, they took control of Mecca and the Hajj, as Amy Gibbons and Samantha correctly noted. Now, there's a second part of the empire that wants to break away, and that's Egypt. And there's a group of people you should be familiar with called the Mamluks. And these Mamluks are slave soldiers. And these are slave soldiers that were taken as Christian slaves from the Caucasus region in this area right here. There's the mountains here, and that's where these Mamluks were from. And the weird thing about Muslim slavery is though you're a slave, you can rise in position and power. And these actually guys were actually responsible, it says on your handout, of controlling Egypt. And they ran Egypt from 1260 to 1517. And even though these Mamluks are slaves in Egypt, they have become generals and officials, and they're kind of important. And they wanted to reassert their independence. So that's not a great situation. The empire is slowly falling apart. And now what happens when an empire falling apart is going to face off with a European country? It's not going to be great because, listen, Europe's gone through two things that's made Europe powerful. What did Europe go through where they focus on physics and astronomy and learning? They had a scientific revolution, and then they applied the scientific revolution to their economy to start mass producing things faster and more quickly because they're not using human or animal power. What did Europe go through after the scientific revolution? Industrial revolution. And guess what? The rest of the world did not. The Ottoman Empire has not gone through a scientific revolution. The Ottoman Empire has not gone through an industrial revolution. So what's going to happen when they fight a European power? It's not going to look so good. In fact, who decided to lead an invasion of Egypt? Napoleon did, right? And Napoleon, it says he invaded and he quickly defeated Egypt in 1798. This invasion that Napoleon did with his quick defeat of Egypt, this was a shocker. In fact, it says on the handout that this invasion shocked Ottomans of how unprepared they were for war with Europe. For a long time, the Ottoman Empire had thought, man, we're better than Europe. And for a long time, they were, because forever, white Europeans were looking to the Ottomans for a lot of stuff that the Ottomans thought were kind of basic. They went to the Ottomans for sugar, for coffee, for paper, for pasta. The Ottomans helped introduce Arabic numerals to the Europeans, or Muslim culture did at least. And so there was a shift over time where at one point the Ottomans really kind of were looking down to some extent upon the Europeans, where the Ottomans were the power to beat. But how did this happen? How did we lose to white Europeans? It was shocking. It says on the handout, well, in 1801, French forces left, and we're introduced with a new character, a man that you should know by name, who wanted to make sure Egypt could never be defeated again, a man who wanted to modernize Egypt, and his name is Muhammad Ali. If you don't know how to spell Muhammad Ali, his name is actually like 3 or 4 lines below on the handout, and we're going to write down that Muhammad Ali was able to seize power, and he sought to follow the example of Napoleon. So he thought, if Napoleon beat us, the person we should follow so that we're never beat again is probably Napoleon. So he wanted to follow the example of Napoleon, and he started the process of, you'll write down, Westernization in Egypt. He wanted to Westernize Egypt. Now, that is a vocabulary word, to Westernize. It basically means to be more European. That word Westernize means to be more modern in a lot of ways. And to Westernize is also to kind of be like what the United States is going through. So the US and Western Europe are all part of Western culture. He says, look, Western culture beat us. We should try to be more like them. And so one of the things it says on the handout is that it says about the army that he modernized the army by training them in Europe. You'll write down. Because Europe was like the best place to have an army, and he decides, look, let's train our guys, let's send them to Europe to learn to fight. So he modernized the army by training them in Europe, and Muhammad Ali even tried to build factories in Egypt in an effort to industrialize Egypt. So he wanted to, make Egypt to be the same power that they should have been. He wants factories because Europe had an industrial revolution. He wants to industrialize because the rest of Europe had industrialized. That's what he wants. Okay, so now I think we're all together on the section Ottoman Reform and the European model. So it turns out that if you're trying to modernize and fix things, some people are probably going to get fired. And you know who really probably needs to get fired? This group of people called the Janissaries. And the Janissaries, they're a problem because the Janissaries, you might remember, they were these Christian slaves, and they were given guns, and they were like good. But as they became more powerful, they started to do weird stuff. They started to have like side businesses, and they started actually hiring substitute soldiers for them. And because of those changes, the Janissaries were actually part of the problem, not part of the solution. And so on our handout, the Janissaries, it says on the handout, we'll write down that they resisted Ottoman efforts to Westernize the army. Where it says on your handout, the Janissaries, will write down that they resisted the Ottoman efforts to modernize the army. They thought this was a bad thing. Because if I'm making the army better, you know what's going to happen to my job? If I've been abusing my power, what's going to happen to my job? What's going to happen? I'm going to lose it, right? So the Janissaries resisted the efforts to further modernize the army. In fact, it says on your handout that they wanted to protect their power rather than see the Westernization of the army. They really just cared about their power. They cared about their position rather than see the Westernization of the army. So there's but which one? So I'm on the second line. We did the Janissaries resisted Ottoman efforts to further modernize the army. And then the line below that, they wanted to protect their power rather than see the westernization of the army. Are you good? Okay. So below that, there's this guy, Selim the Third, and his reforms were challenged, it says on the handout, by religious Muslims. Why would religious Muslims want to stop westernization? Why would religious Muslims not want to follow Napoleon? Well, if you're a religious Muslim and your country has problems, who should you be following? Who's got the answers? Whose example should you try to emulate? Muhammad, right? Like, this is like the worst thing ever. Why are we following dead white men when we should be following the prophet, the most perfect man who ever lived? We should be following him. And so these religious Muslims were not happy. It says that many of his reforms were suspended, and in fact, he was executed by the military. So there are people who don't agree about like change. There's people who don't agree that we should westernize. Westernize means to be more like Europe, more like the US. But then we have another leader, a guy named Mahmud II. And he wanted, it says on the handout, to continue for reforms, continue to reform. He wanted to continue to make Europe make the Ottoman Empire like Europe. And one of the reasons he wanted to continue to reform is that there's things that he saw that were going wrong that he thought we need to deal with. For example, there's the problem of Greece. Now, you should be able to identify Greece on a map. This is Greece right here. And the problem with Greece is that Greece was really important to Europeans because a lot of the things that we have in our world today, we got from the Greeks. For example, the word democracy comes from Greece. The word philosophy, the word science, all these different words that we have and the ideas behind them, we get them from the Greeks. And another thing that we all get from the Greeks is the idea of individual rights. The idea that all of us in this room were individuals, and we have rights, and we have freedoms. These are ideas that kind of started in ancient Greece. And so because Greece started, it is thought, Western civilization, other Europeans wanted to help out Greece because Greece is literally conquered by the Ottoman Empire. So it says on the handout that Greek independence in 1829, it revealed the need to fix the empire. It revealed the need to fix the empire. Greece had gained independence, and this kind of freaked out the Ottomans, and they realized, they argued, we have to do something to make our government better, or else the entire empire is going to go away. Now, white Europeans were really excited about helping the Greeks to gain their independence because the Greeks are white European Christians and the other Europeans are white Christians as well. They're trying to help out their friends here. And it says on your handout that this was seen as an evidence of a clash of civilizations. A clash of civilizations. In other words, there's a view that there's two different sides here. There's Muslim civilization of the Ottomans, and there's a white Christian civilization of the Europeans. And this war is just kind of like an example. Whose culture is better? Is Muslim culture better, or is white European culture better? It says on the handout that Europeans, they wanted to help Greece because they saw Greece, it says on the handout, as the basis of their Western civilization. They thought all the things that we have, all the things we believe, it all started in Greece. Greece is the basis of Western civilization. So Europeans came to help out. England gave money, Russia gave money. As a result, rule in Greece and Egypt weakened, and Europeans, it says on your handout, saw this as evidence that Western civilization was better than Islamic civilization. Western civilization was better than Islamic civilization. Well, that's embarrassing, right? We lost Greece. Greece got their freedom. So if our army sucks, who do we need to fire? Who's the guys in our army that are causing a lot of the problems? The Janissaries. So it says on the handout, elimination of the Janissaries. They blame them for the loss and were fired. So we just got rid of the janissaries. We've had the janissaries forever, and now we have fired the janissaries. But there's another thing that we start to look at, and there's a vocabulary word on your handout that you should be familiar with. It's the word secularization. What does the word secular mean? So it says on the handout that they were blamed for the loss of the war and they were fired. We got rid of the janissaries. They're part of the problem. But they're not the only part of the problem. There's a second part of the problem that they want to solve by a process that we call secularization. So that's based on the root word secular. What does the word secular mean? It means non-religious. We go to a secular school, like even though you can be a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian, at LaPorte High School, we don't have prayer time, we don't have chapel, we don't have Bible study, we don't have Mr. Grammar praying before lunch. We are a secular school. Well, back at this time in the Ottoman Empire, it was not a secular school. Guess what was the main subject taught in school in the Ottoman Empire? Specifically, Islam. Like, hey, first period is Quran. Second period, let's study some Quran. Third period, maybe a little life of the Prophet Muhammad. Fourth period, maybe a little bit more Muhammad. Fifth period, I was thinking we'd study the Quran. And sixth and seventh, I thought we'd finish our day by, the Quran. So a lot of schools were just preparing people to like memorize the Quran, which is like impressive. Like if you can literally memorize the Quran in Arabic, that's pretty impressive. But we're not teaching kids things like physics. And even though it may not seem like a natural connection, if you want a good army, you need people who know physics. Why? So you can know how projectiles work, and actually we can make better guns if we study physics. So they thought, okay, fire the janissaries, great idea. Number two, fix the schools. The schools are not doing a good job, so let's secularize the schools. We see the reduction in the influence of religious groups by putting education under, we'll write down, the authority of the government. We have government-run secular schools now. We're not going to be teaching Quran 7 periods out of the day. We're going to teach things like physics and things like math. We're going to fix the schools. So a couple solutions. Number one, we got rid of the janissaries. Number two, we're secularizing the schools. And number three is a vocabulary word that you should be familiar with. That vocabulary word is called the tanzimat. What is the tanzimat? Two words that give a brief description, and I'll explain it. You'll write down next to tanzimat, these are Western reforms. These are Western reforms. And these Western reforms include some things that we all enjoy and that we all have to this day. And that's because this idea of fixing the government with these reforms, they're borrowing it from another culture's ideas. In fact, on the board, on the upper right-hand corner, there's a vocabulary term I wrote. What is that vocabulary term on the upper right-hand corner of the board that I wrote? Magna Carta. I want you to write down the word Magna Carta where it says it included some rights like the Magna Carta. That's a proper noun. Write that in that blank, like the Magna Carta. That's M-A-G-N-A, capital C-A-R-T-A, the Magna Carta. I'm going to explain what that thing is. We're writing this down where it says included some rights like the Magna Carta. Make sure you put that in your blank. I'm going to explain what that piece of paper is, because it's a piece of paper. But it's like one of the most important pieces of papers ever written. Some of you have Disney Plus, and on Disney Plus, there's a cartoon called Robin Hood. This is like a cartoon made back in the 70s. You know that story of Robin Hood? What kind of people does Robin Hood steal from? And he gives it to the poor. Well, there's a Disney version of Robin Hood, and in Robin Hood, the cartoon, it's like Robin Hood's played by a fox, and there's like a bad king who's like a lion, and he's kind of a jerk because he like arbitrarily like raises taxes. Well, it turns out there was a real King John who was considered and viewed really as a jerk. And they didn't want to like kill the king or like rebel against the king, but they said, tell you what, king, we're going to have a piece of paper, let's call it the Magna Carta, and we're going to say that there's some things you can do as king, and there's some things you cannot do as king. And if you want to keep your job, you need to sign this piece of paper. This paper is called the Magna Carta. And that's like a really big deal because kings were used to kind of doing whatever they wanted. Kings were used to kind of just following their own instincts. But now the King of England agreed he couldn't do whatever he wanted. Now, by the way, how does that inspire us as Americans? What piece of paper tells our president he can't do whatever he wants? He's limited. The Constitution, right? So the Magna Carta is important because it sets the example of a document that limits the power of the king. It says on the handout, what are some of the things the Magna Carta gives the people of England and now in the Ottoman Empire? One thing is public trials. That's a big deal because what if you were accused of a crime and we arrested you and we sent you away and people are like, yeah, whatever happened to Lecon? And you're like, oh, well, he was put on trial. When did that happen? Oh, it's not important. What was he accused of? Oh, bad stuff. Well, was there any evidence? Oh, yeah, there's a ton of evidence. Like, if the government could put you on trial without ever making people able to see what's going on, you could have real abuse of power. Right now, you might know there's a famous trial happening right now in Minneapolis. Last year, George Floyd was killed by a police officer who put his knee on his neck for like 9 minutes. That officer is arrested, and he's right now, today, on trial. You can go to YouTube right now and see the trial about the death of George Floyd right now. That way, you could even make your own decision. Oh, totally guilty. Or, man, that guy's innocent. It's public. It's a public trial. It's not being hidden. It's not secret. You can see all the things that are happening. Also, we have on your handout, write down equal protection under the law. Equal protection under the law. What that means is if I today, as a brown man, get arrested, I will be given a lawyer. I will have my rights read to me. I have the right to remain silent. Anything I say can and will be used against me in a court of law. I have a right to an attorney. If I cannot afford one, one will be appointed for me. That is what happens to me as a brown Hispanic man in America. If a white man or a black man gets arrested, they'll have their Miranda rights read. And if they cannot afford a lawyer, guess what? They'll be given a lawyer paid for by the United States government. We have what is called equal protection under the law. So these are changes. We saw that they fired the Janissaries. We saw that they tried to fix the schools by making them secular. And now we have written rights under the Tanzimat that are saying there's things the government can and the government cannot do. Finally, on this section, it says Westernization. It says on the handout that soldiers were sent to train in Europe. They thought, man, Europe has the best army, they have the best military. If we want our guys to be the best, let's send them where the best are. And so they sent them to train in Europe. And schooling, it says on the handout, in Ottoman Empire was modeled after Europe. They thought, man, Europe has the best schools. Let's have our schools look like European schools. And because of that, they even wanted to copy European languages. And there was one language that was the most popular of European languages in the 1800s. There was one language that if you knew this language, they thought you were educated, they thought you were intelligent, they thought you were like up to date. And we're going to write down on the handout that French became a preferred language among the educated elite. French did. So even though I speak Arabic, even though I speak Kurdish, even though I speak a Berber language, man, if I am smart, I'm going to learn French. And then I'm going to show off my French skills. That shows people I'm educated and I'm elite. Now in 2021, it's not French people are rushing to learn. What language are people globally wanting to learn? English. So you can pretty much go anywhere today. You can go to Iraq, Afghanistan, you can go to Rwanda, you can go to Cambodia, and there's people who are trying to learn English or wanting to practice their English. Right now, there's whole schools in China where their instruction is given in English. There's schools in the Middle East where they hire American teachers to come teach English because they want their kids to learn English. English in 2021, lucky for us, is the international language because we as Americans don't have to learn Chinese. They want to learn English. So it's a good place we're in right now. It says, finally, there's a blank. And one last thing that started to change in the Ottoman Empire, we'll write down, newspapers were introduced. This is a brand new thing. Newspapers were not a thing. Now, also, by the way, What kind of technology do you need to make newspapers a daily reality? You need a printing press. And, for various reasons, the Muslim world was late in getting the printing press. But now that I have a printing press, I can write the news every single day to comment and to discuss and to bring up relevant issues. So that's all great and that's all good. Now, next section, reforms in the Ottoman Empire. So, Westernization and decline. So after this war, after the war that Greece got their independence, they continued to westernize, which created many government jobs, but government spending was out of control. It says on the handout, you'll write down government spending was out of control. So that's not a good thing, because what is the big worry when you start charging stuff you don't have on the government account? What is your economy going to experience? If you're just charging, you're going to experience inflation, right? And it says this government spending was out of control. And when you spend money you don't have, what do you do to get that money that you don't have? You have to do what? You have to get a loan. Now, this is not like, oh, me going to the bank to get a loan. I am a country that needs to get a loan. So where do countries get loans from? Countries borrow from other countries. And what kind of countries in general are the Ottomans going to ask money from? Which would be Europeans. And so this relationship is going to produce a situation where it says they continue to take out, you'll write down, foreign loans. They took out foreign loans. And they also lowered different barriers, these protective tariffs that favored, you'll write down, Europeans. So they're borrowing from Europe. They are entering into relationships that favor Europe. This is not a good thing, because listen, whenever you borrow money, what do you have to do with the money that you're borrowing? You pay it back, but what else do you do? You have to pay interest. Now listen, interest will kill you. I'll give you an example. Last year, during the pandemic, all of my major appliances broke. My refrigerator broke, my dishwasher broke, and my oven, the whole thing broke. Well, the fridge had been old. The washing machine had been struggling for years, like originally came with everything happened in the same time. So obviously I need a fridge. I don't need a dishwasher, but it makes life easier. I definitely need a stove. I'm not gonna hot plate it with like a family of 6, all right, kids. So we went to Best Buy and we opened up a charge account and we charged $5,000 and got all 3. On the bottom of the bill, it tells you only pay $120 a month. You're like, wow, that's such a good deal. Only $120 a month for $5,000 of stuff? That's awesome. But then it tells you how long it'll take you to pay off the loan. And then it'll tell you how much you'll end up paying in interest and the balance. And my bill said, even though my account was $5,000, I'll end up spending $10,000. Now, they don't want you to think about that, because they want you to think, wow, how cool it is that you just pay $120 a month. But you're actually going to pay double. So when I got my stimulus check, you know what I did with my stimulus check? I paid it off, right? And I'm actually doing myself a favor down the line. Well, these Ottomans are borrowing money from the Europeans, and the Europeans love it because they're going to get so much money back. That's why you shouldn't get credit cards, by the way. Now, on the back side of the handout, there's something really, really challenging that happens in the Ottoman Empire. Because, once you owe someone money, you kind of are like enslaved to them in some way. And so what happens is the Ottoman Empire turns to Europe for cash, and they borrow a ridiculous amount of money. And because I owe you money, I start asking for favors of you. Like, for example, if like someone gave Samantha a ride to school every single day and never asked for gas or whatever, you might say, hey, come on, like, you owe me, right? Like, you might be like, hey, I picked you up, I took you here, I don't ask for your gas, you kind of owe me. Well, the Ottoman Empire is borrowing a lot from Europe. And Europe says, you know what? I've been lending you a lot of money. I'm going to start asking for favors. And there's two types of favors that are kind of awkward. Well, one of the favors they start asking is that white people, white Europeans, want to do business in the Ottoman Empire. But a lot of these white Europeans, they get to the Ottoman Empire, and they're like, you know what? I don't feel it's safe in all these neighborhoods. What I really wish there was a neighborhood in Egypt. I wish there was a neighborhood in Syria. I wish there was a neighborhood in Turkey that was a white-only neighborhood, a neighborhood where only Europeans could live. And man, it would be so cool if in Egypt or Syria, there was neighborhoods that Muslims could not even go to. Now, that's weird because you're saying you want to move to my country of Egypt and you want there to be white-only, European-only neighborhoods in Egypt so you feel more safe? That's kind of like embarrassing, right? But because I owe the Europeans so much money, you know what the Ottomans say to that request? They say, yes, we'll do it. There's a second thing that white Europeans ask. They say, you know what? I don't like going to Egypt to do business because I always get hassled by the cops and they ask me for a bribe. How about this? Let's make a law that says if I'm a white European and I move to Egypt or I move to Syria or I move to North Africa, if I break the law, you can't arrest me because I'm a white European. That would be really weird. It would be like if these migrants from Central America are like, yeah, we're going to cross the border illegally, but you cannot arrest me. If I run a red light, if I am DWI, you cannot ever hold me accountable. We'd say, I'm sorry, El Salvador, we're never going to agree to that. That's ridiculous. But listen, that's what white Europeans ask for. They say, we want to make it impossible that you ever arrest us for breaking the law. And since you owe us so much money, are you going to go along with this? And guess what the Ottoman Empire has to say? They say yes. Now, there's a word to describe what I just gave two examples of. The word that is used to describe what I gave two examples of is called extraterritoriality. It says on the handout that Europeans were allowed on the handout to live in the Ottoman Empire. They were allowed to live in the Ottoman Empire in certain European-only centers. European-only centers. So there was literal neighborhoods in the Ottoman Empire where only white Europeans were allowed to live. It says on the handout they lived by their own laws, and they were exempt from Ottoman laws and punishment. They lived by their own laws, and they were exempt from Ottoman laws and punishment, which is crazy that they were able to get these types of things. But because the Ottomans owed money, what can you do? What can you say? It says on the handout that balance of trade, vast amounts of products were imported, but few were exported. In other words, they were buying European products, but Europeans were not interested in Ottoman products. This is a big change because it used to be white people were buying sugar and white people were buying spices and stuff like that. But where are white Europeans getting their sugar now if we're not getting it from the Ottoman Empire? Where are white people getting their sugar from? They're what? Where are they growing it? In the colonies. All these countries, Spain and Portugal and France and England, they've got colonies where they have some enslaved laborer from Africa growing it. And how much do I pay that slave? Nothing. They are making it themselves. They don't need the Ottoman Empire anymore. It says on the handout this was bad for the economy, and it led to, you'll write down, inflation. It led to inflation. So not a good thing, and we're going to see a lot of different challenges. We'll actually stop right here. We'll take a part two in a bit, but right now that's a good place to stop. We'll have a part two when we return.